the U.S. Saying that it didn't give Israel advance notice that it would be holding talks with Hamas. Um, Ali, why don't you bring us up to date on the significance of that? Maybe flesh that out a little bit more. And, as Sarah was saying, it's the first time, I think, ever that a U.S. administration has been willing to actually go to a Palestinian political faction in direct negotiations with matters that involve Palestinian rights, besides, of course, the subcontractor of the PA. But what's the significance of this?
Yeah, there's a lot. I want to lay the context, if I can, and then get into some of this, because I think it's all a lot of the events that are going on are sort of interwoven and have to be thought of together. And I prepared all my notes yesterday, and then so many other things happened,
Yeah.
and that's the way it is. So you're trying to keep up to the last minute. There's been breaking news even in the last couple of hours while we've been on air. So I guess I want to, so yes, it's now been confirmed that the United States, the White House itself confirmed that the US representative on hostages, Adam Boehler, met with Hamas officials and in fact continued to meet with them through last night and into today in Doha in Qatar. But let's go back. We'll come back to that, but let's go back to Tuesday and what happened with Trump's State of the Union address. This was his first big address, first big speech since reassuming office in January, and he said remarkably little about Palestine during that speech, and that surprised many people. Let's take a look at what he did say, Tamara. Let's play that video.
At least we're bringing back our hostages from Gaza. In my first term, we achieved one of the most groundbreaking peace agreements in generations, the Abraham Accords. And now we're going to build on that foundation to create a more peaceful and prosperous future for the entire region. A lot of things are happening in the Middle East. People have been talking about that so much lately with everything going on with Ukraine and Russia. But a lot of things are happening in the Middle East. It's a rough neighborhood, actually.
So
His
that was a
ad
lot.
libs.
Yeah, that was a longish clip, but that was really all he said. So it was about less than a minute in a speech that was over an hour and a half. And there were no great declarations of love for Israel, which I thought was interesting, and no threats against Hamas, and no repetition of his Riviera Trump
Mm.
Gaza dreams. And I thought that was interesting. And it was also notable that throughout his speech, Trump paid personal tribute to many of the guests who had been brought into the House chamber, praising them um, as the camera focused on their reactions. But he didn't point out the former Israeli captives in Gaza, including Noah Argamani and Yair Hon, or the family members of US citizens who are still in Gaza, who are watching as the president spoke. And I would have found it hard to imagine that Joe Biden would have skipped them over that way. But there was something else in the speech that caught my attention, and that was not directly about Palestine. It was when Trump was talking about Russia and Ukraine. Let's listen to this short clip.
Time to stop this madness. It's time to halt the killing. It's time to end the senseless war. If you want to end wars, you have to talk to both sides.
Yeah, and I remember when I was watching the speech on Tuesday night, I thought, well, that actually makes sense, but I wondered why that didn't apply to Palestine as well. But of course, the very next day on Wednesday, we learned that in fact the United States is talking to Hamas, and this news was broken by the website Axios, which reported that the Trump administration has been holding direct talks with Hamas over the release of US hostages held in Gaza and the possibility of a broader deal to end the war. Two sources with direct knowledge of the discussions tell Axios. And then the New York Times also reported on Wednesday that US and Hamas officials have held talks in Qatar about hostages held in the Gaza Strip, according to two Israeli officials and a Western official and a diplomat briefed on the matter, breaking with long-standing American policy of refusing to directly engage with groups that it has designated as terrorists. And the New York Times also revealed that the United States did not consult Israel in advance, and that Israel learned about this through other channels.
What does that mean?
We don't
That's
know
really
Explain.
exactly.
interesting.
What
I
are
mean,
these other channels?
yeah. I mean, that sounds like spying on the Israeli spying on the US, to be frank, but it's also very
It wouldn't have been
interesting.
the first time either, of course.
Like,
No.
I believe Trump said soon after this that Israel did know about this beforehand, or I read that somewhere else. Maybe it wasn't Trump's Truth Social. I forget the source now, but that strikes me as a sort of after the fact justification by the Israelis of trying to sort of, I don't know, keep on
Well,
top of events.
we don't know who told them. I mean, it could have been someone in the U.S. We
Yeah.
don't know. That's speculation, but it is interesting that the U.S. didn't tell Israel in advance, because usually they coordinate on everything that has to do with the Palestinians. And all that seemed quite positive, pragmatic, and momentous. And as the reporting says, a significant departure from the policy of all previous administrations. But it was in keeping with the precedent set by Trump during his first administration, when he agreed to negotiate with the US withdrawal from Afghanistan directly with the Taliban. And those negotiations were also held in Doha and Qatar. And of course, Trump also spoke to or met with the North Korean leader during his first term, and in this term is talking directly to Russia, which was the context of the clip we just saw. But then a few hours later comes this really horrifying social media posting from Donald Trump, which I'll read. It's for those who are listening, but I think people have to hear it to sort of compare and contrast. And he says, "Shalom Hamas means hello and goodbye. You can choose. Release all of the hostages now, not later, and immediately return all of the dead bodies of the people you murdered, or it is over for you. Only sick and twisted people keep bodies, and you are sick and twisted. I'm sending Israel everything it needs to finish the job. Not a single Hamas member will be safe if you don't do as I say. I have just met with your former hostages whose lives you have destroyed. This is your last warning. For the leadership, now is the time to leave Gaza while you still have a chance. Also, to the people of Gaza, a beautiful future awaits you, but not if you hold hostages. If you do, you are dead. Make a smart decision. Release the hostages now, or there will be hell to pay later." So an apparently explicit threat also against the entire civilian population in Gaza. And of course, when he said that only sick and twisted people keep bodies, he probably didn't know that he was referring to Israel, which has had a policy for decades of keeping the bodies of Palestinians as a spiteful form of collective punishment against their families. And in 2019, the Israeli High Court explicitly authorized the government to hold on to the bodies of Palestinians for use as bargaining chips in negotiations. You see that right there on the from B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights group. A couple of new developments that I want to point to. I think it makes sense to. Well, actually, I want to come to a report that just came out in Haaretz while we've been on air, but let me just say that this threat is very disturbing. But I think, Asa, you pointed out in one of our private discussions earlier that this is not the first time we've heard these almost verbatim threats. This seems a bit more explicit, but
Yeah, it
Trump,
seems like it seems like the third time. Like he's made a very, direct threat that Hamas must release all the so-called hostages immediately, otherwise, you'll regret it. They'll be hell to play, and so on and so forth. By now, it's starting to look like an empty threat,
well,
because
maybe that's what I want to get to. Is it an empty
mm,
threat? And
mm,
I'm working my way there, so bear with me.
mm,
But he also, and as I think you pointed out, Asa, made a threat like this just before the January 19th ceasefire took hold.
yeah,
So, is it a negotiating tactic? Again, also, we saw it in that meeting with Netanyahu in the White House a few weeks ago, just before they returned, Israel and the US returned again to implementing the ceasefire deal after apparently threatening to pull out of it. Some news reports that came this morning tell us that let me see a few headlines that broke this morning. Let me just find my place in my notes. That Egyptian sources, this is from Reuters, Egyptian sources said on Thursday that a US envoy held talks with Hamas leaders and mediators from Egypt and Qatar overnight into Thursday. According to the sources, the discussions ended positively and indicate a near transition to the second stage of a ceasefire with Israel. The sides discussed governance in Gaza after the war, including names of those who had managed the territory, according to the sources. That's very interesting because if those reports are true, then that tells us this is about something far broader than just the release of captives who are US citizens. And then another report, this is in Haaretz, which says the US proposed that Hamas release 10 living hostages in exchange for extending the Gaza ceasefire by 2 months. Washington proposed that Hamas release 10 living hostages in exchange for a 2-month extension of the Gaza ceasefire, including the resumption of humanitarian aid. A Palestinian source told Sky News Arabia. According to the report, Hamas is reviewing the proposal. Also today, Hamas reiterated its commitment to the truce and says the mediators continue efforts to compel Israel to start the second stage of negotiations, which, as John has reminded us this week and in previous weeks, those second phase negotiations were supposed to have started some time ago and haven't yet. Now, a couple more interesting things, and then I want to get to this item in Haaretz. That, as I said, Trump didn't mention the hostages really. He just mentioned them in passing, or the released captives, in his State of the Union address. But he met with them on Wednesday in the Oval Office. And it was just after he met them that he posted that really horrific genocidal post. And what's notable is that the former Israeli captives who met Trump on Wednesday issued a statement thanking Trump and his Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff for making their release possible by brokering the ceasefire deal, and urged them to continue their efforts to get the rest out. According to the Times of Israel, freed captive Eli Sharabi said the group met with Trump, quote, to ensure that the 59 hostages still being held will be released through an agreement for their return as soon as possible, and thanked the US president and Witkoff for being committed to this goal. So the words through an agreement, I think, are important there.
And just to point out, Hamas has proposed since the very beginning in October 2023 for an all-for-all, captive exchange. You empty the Israeli prisons, the Israeli torture camps of the thousands and thousands of Palestinian men, women, and children, and Israel gets its captives back. It is not, and in exchange for lifting the siege and adhering to international laws, ending the occupation. And Israel has been the one over and over again to reject this.
Right. So you're completely right, Nora. And none of what we're saying now is about whether Hamas is willing to commit to the agreement. The question is whether Israel and the United States are willing to commit to the agreement that they signed, that the United States helped broker. And an interesting thing, I mean, of course, there would have been no agreement without the resistance forcing Israel to accept a ceasefire. That's always has to be in the foreground. But ironically, one of the driving forces apparently keeping the deal on track so far on the Israeli and American side appears to be Miriam Adelson, the fanatically anti-Palestinian widow of casino mogul Sheldon Adelson. And as everyone knows, she very famously gave Donald Trump $100 million donation. The Adelsons did that in 2022. As well.
He said moving the embassy to Jerusalem was kind of a quid pro quo for Adelson's support.
Yeah, and people are saying now that Adelson has a great deal of influence over Trump. Well, apparently she does, but what she has been pushing for is for the ceasefire deal to keep going. And in fact, the Israeli captives, former captives who met with Trump on Wednesday, were actually flown to Washington on Miriam Adelson's private jet. And it was reported in early February that she personally intervened with Trump to stop Netanyahu from sabotaging the deal and returning to war. An article by Uri Misgav in Haaretz on February 12th states the following. This is from February 12th, so almost a month ago. Quote, Netanyahu is determined to resume the war and end the hostage and ceasefire deal. It may well be that by the time you are reading this, it will already have happened. Trump has proposed or has been persuaded to open the gates of hell. Miriam Adelson started up her private plane and flew to Washington on Wednesday, this is back in early February, to convince him to put a stop to it before we reach the abyss. So that's very interesting. Now, the final point I want to make on this before we sort of throw it open is this story, Tamara. I'm going to drop it in the StreamYard chat that appears in Haaretz today. And the headline is, new Israeli army chief set to present plans to resume fighting in Gaza, retake key areas. A very scary headline. And then it says, the plan that Eyal Zamir is expected to present includes the deployment of several divisions across Gaza, which would require the IDF to enlist more reservists. Now, keep in mind what Donald Trump said yesterday, which is, I've given Israel everything they need to finish the job. And now here we have the Israeli army chief. We're going to put together a plan to finish the job. Well, not so fast. Let's read what Haaretz actually says here. Israel Defense Forces Chief of Staff Eyal Zamir is set to hold a situational assessment on Thursday evening, during which he's expected to present plans for the resumption of widespread fighting in Gaza. Defense officials say that Zamir's plan would necessitate several divisions that would retake areas across Gaza, including areas that the Israeli army left during the first stage of the ceasefire agreement. Sources with knowledge of the plan's details have cast doubt over the IDF's ability to draft the amount of reserve soldiers needed to implement such a plan over a sustained period of time. Several defense officials who spoke with Haaretz say that the army is having difficulties filling the ranks of the reserve divisions, and many reservists have already said they would have difficulties enlisting for several months once again. Other officials said that in some of the reserve brigades, only 50% of those summoned for duty have showed up, forcing those brigades to enlist reservists from other units within the army. Additionally, sources said that many officers in the IDF reserves have made it clear that they plan to end their service and not continue volunteering for combat operations in Gaza, citing their belief that the return to fighting is based on political considerations, all the while endangering the lives of the hostages held in Gaza, which was the main motivating factor to enlist since October 7th. And it goes on to talk about commanders in the reserve say that the amount of burnout of reservists and the condition of the equipment will make it hard for some brigades and units to enter combat with the same capabilities that they did at the start of the war. So does that sound to you like the Israeli army is ready to go back to full-scale war? Of course, we can never be sure or underestimate them, but notice what Donald Trump said. He didn't say that America is going to go to war in Gaza, no US troops, no boots on the ground. He said Israel would do it. Israel would, open the gates of hell on Gaza. So the question here is, if we're to try to assess the situation, from October 7th, as John showed us, until now, the Israeli army remains defeated. And Trump has verbally signaled to Israel multiple times, including when Netanyahu was in the White House, you want to go back to war? I'm not going to stop you. We're going to give you whatever you want. And yet Israel hasn't. And here we have, even with all these crazy statements from Trump, reports not just of serious negotiations moving towards phase two, but serious negotiations that are directly between the United States and Hamas. So while nothing is certain, I guess the adage, watch what they do and not what they say, is going to help guide us through this.
I think the Israeli military, the soldiers know at this point that they're not going back into Gaza to save the captives. Like they believed that. Many of them, you can see in their testimonies, many of them believed that they were going into Gaza to rescue their comrades and the other Israelis that were in Gaza. And very quickly they realized that wasn't an objective of any of their battles. And then they went back and fought in the same places 3 and 4 times, Jabalia 5 times. And none of those times were they trying to get their captives back. And so at some point, they're verbally expressing the fact that the way to get their captives back is to negotiate. And so they're going to end up, I think, by and large, being on the side of wanting to continue to get their captives back, who are their soldiers, who are they're supposedly committed to, and they hope as soldiers themselves that the rest of their military will be committed to them when they end up in Gaza in a tunnel, which is sure to happen again in the future. So I think I'm not surprised that they're not gung-ho to go back and fight in these places that they couldn't win the first time.
Yeah, I think that what's really interesting about that Haaretz article, Ali, that you brought out there was the fact that the Israelis cannot sustain and remand their reserve battalions, and that very much lined up with what we were reporting before the ceasefire, which is that the Israeli army and the Israeli military in general was essentially very close to collapse, just in terms of its manpower. Like John was saying, they were returning 2, 3, 4 times to the same places in the Gaza Strip, supposedly having dealt with them, having cleared them, and every time returning again and again and just getting absolutely burnt out. And this makes sense with what, why would Miriam Adelson, the leading Israel lobby financier in the United States, she's an Israeli as it goes, but who funds, as well as Trump funds all these pro-Israel lobby groups. Why would she be supportive of a ceasefire? Well, in a sense, for Israel, it's better that they have a sort of managed ceasefire than a complete collapse of their forces, which, you know, sounds impossible, right? But it's always impossible till it happens. And they wouldn't want to see a repeat of what happened to them in South Lebanon in 2000.
So
yeah,
yeah.
what happens next? I mean, I saw reports before we went on air that there were like rumblings that Israel had kind of quietly, reluctantly agreed to continue the negotiations and move to stage two, even though there hasn't been an official announcement yet. I mean, where do we stand? We're kind of in this like no man's land of time
I
and
mean,
space
it
right
you know,
now.
Israel is in a situation where, or let's say, they can't go back to fighting for the reasons we've discussed. But if they declare an end to the war, then they also look defeated.
Right.
So it's sort of a checkmate situation for them. We heard our friends in Gaza telling us that nobody wants to go back to the war, but people have seen the worst and they're not going to surrender. So
Yeah.
it's not like more of the same is going to
No.
produce a different result.
And that's
And
essentially what Abu Ubaidah said too in the transcript, a little
yeah,
note that I saw. Yeah.
and he
Yeah.
said, I still haven't watched his whole speech, but just from the headlines we're seeing, that he said, and that's the same message that's been coming from the political leadership. Hamas is committed to the deal as long as the other parties are committed to it, but they're ready for anything.
Yeah.
And I think that's also the importance of the of the military displays which Hamas put on during the first weeks of the ceasefire, when they were returning the captives that John broke down for us week after week, because that was also critically important to signal to everyone, especially the Israelis and the Americans, that we're not a spent force. Your choices are to continue with this process in which you get your people back, or to go back to a war which we're ready for and whose consequences and whose results are not going to be different for you.
Yeah.
And so that's where we are.